On November 18, 1978, deep in the suffocating heat of the Guyanese jungle, over 900 people took their final breaths in unison. Cups filled with cyanide-laced punch sat beside them. Bodies littered the ground. Children, parents, elders, friends. A tape recorder still whirred, capturing the chilling echoes of Jim Jones' final sermon. But how did they get here? How did an entire community willingly walk into death? This is the true, haunting story of the Jonestown Massacre, the deadliest mass suicide in history. To understand the horror of Jonestown, we must first understand the man behind it. Jim Jones wasn't always a prophet of doom. Born in 1931 in rural Indiana, he was an outcast, fascinated by death and religion from an early age. He preached to animals in the fields, held mock funerals, and developed an uncanny ability to manipulate those around him. By the 1950s, Jones had transformed from a small-town misfit into a charismatic preacher. He founded the People's Temple, a religious movement that promised racial equality, socialism, and an escape from the corruption of American society. Thousands flocked to his side, mesmerized by his booming voice and hypnotic gaze. But behind the pulpit, Jones was not the savior he pretended to be. By the mid-1970s, whispers of abuse, fraud, and mind control began circulating. Defectors spoke of beatings, staged miracles, and Jones' increasing paranoia. The media took notice. Under growing scrutiny, Jones devised his grandest illusion yet, a utopia hidden away from prying eyes. Jonestown. In 1974, deep within the sweltering jungle of Guyana, he carved out a settlement, a self-sufficient commune where his followers could live free from oppression. The promise was tantalizing. Hundreds sold their homes, gave up their savings, and left their lives behind to follow their leader into the unknown. But paradise was an illusion. When they arrived, they found something far different from the idyllic haven they had been promised. The soil was poor, the conditions brutal, and food scarce. Armed guard patrolled the borders, making escape impossible. Jones controlled every aspect of life, broadcasting his sermons through loudspeakers day and night. Exhausted, starving, and isolated, his followers had nowhere to turn. And Jim Jones' descent into madness had only just begun. By 1978, Jonestown had become a prison. Jones, now addicted to drugs, was no longer the energetic, benevolent leader they had once followed. His sermons grew darker. Paranoia dripped from every word. He spoke of enemies lurking in the shadows, CIA plots, government conspiracies. He told his followers they were under siege. He warned them of what was coming. They practiced for it. Jones called them white night drills, rehearsals for mass death. In the dead of night, he would wake his followers and instruct them to drink from a cup, telling them it was poison. They obeyed, believing their end had come. Then he would laugh. It was only a test, he'd say, a test of loyalty. But one night, the poison would be real. Back in the United States, families of temple members grew worried. Their letters were censored, their calls scripted. Some had heard rumors of people being held against their will, of beatings, of Jones losing control. One congressman decided to investigate. On November 17, 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Guyana with journalists and concerned relatives. When he stepped into Jonestown, Jones put on a show, a well-rehearsed performance of smiling followers, bountiful gardens, and a thriving community. At first, Ryan was convinced. But then, someone slipped him a note. "Please help us," it read. "We want to leave." Ryan had seen enough. The next morning, he prepared to take defectors back with him. But as they reached the airstrip, gunmen appeared. Shots rang out. Ryan was dead. The reporters were dead. Those trying to escape, slaughtered. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones gathered his people. He told them there was no turning back now. The government would come. They would all be tortured, their children taken. There was only one way out. The final white night had begun. And that's when the first child screamed. The first child screamed. A shriek of terror, high-pitched and piercing, cut through the humid air of Jonestown. A mother clutched her baby to her chest, eyes darting wildly as armed guards closed in. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Jim Jones stood on a wooden platform at the front of the pavilion. his dark glasses masking his bloodshot eyes. The microphone in his hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "This is not suicide," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. "This is a revolutionary act." The vat of cyanide-laced fruit punch sat in the center of the crowd, the sickly sweet scent mixing with the stench of sweat and fear. His most loyal followers, the ones closest to the stage, moved first. Mothers dipped syringes into the poison and pressed them against their infants' lips. Children wrenched and gagged as the deadly cocktail burned its way down. Their small bodies convulsed before collapsing into the dirt. Some resisted, a few begged, but the guards stood ready, rifles in hand. There was no choice. And then silence. When the sun rose over Jonestown the next morning, there were no more screams. Only death. Nearly 1,000 bodies lay sprawled across the settlement, arranged in rows as if in some grotesque ritual. The Guyanese authorities arrived first, stunned into horrified silence as they took in the devastation. The U.S. military followed, sent to recover the remains. But something didn't add up. Among the dead, one body stood out, the lifeless form of Jim Jones himself. But unlike the others, he had not taken the poison. He had been shot in the head. The official story was that Jones had committed suicide. One final, cowardly act as his grand vision crumbled around him. But not everyone was convinced. Some of the survivors, those who had managed to hide in the jungle during the massacre, whispered a different story. They claimed Jones hadn't pulled the trigger at all. "Someone killed him," one survivor later said. "I heard the shot. It didn't come from where he was standing. It came from behind." If that was true, then who had murdered Jim Jones? As investigators combed through the wreckage of Jonestown, they uncovered disturbing inconsistencies. Many of the victims showed signs of struggle, bruises, and needle marks on their arms. Had they been forced to take the poison? Some of the so-called suicides had gunshot wounds. If they had willingly taken their own lives, why had they been shot? Most chilling of all, several hundred bodies had no traces of cyanide in their systems at all. Had the final white night been a massacre rather than a mass suicide? As the investigation deepened, an even stranger discovery came to light. A survivor, an enigmatic man known only as Mr. X, emerged with shocking claim. He insisted that Jim Jones had not acted alone. There had been another force behind Jonestown, an unseen power pulling the strings. He refused to name names, but his message was clear. This wasn't just a cult gone mad, he said. This was something much bigger, something planned. And then, without warning, he vanished. The deeper the U.S. government dug into the ruins of Jonestown, the more questions arose. Jones had been obsessed with the idea of spies, infiltrators, and government conspiracies. His paranoia had seemed like the ravings of a madman. But what if he wasn't entirely wrong? In the wreckage of his personal quarters, investigators found hundreds of classified documents. Some appeared to detail secretive experiments in mind control. Others hinted at connections to powerful political figures. Then, just as quickly as they had been discovered, the files disappeared. In the weeks following the massacre, key figures connected to Jonestown began dying under mysterious circumstances. Former members, journalists, and even officials involved in the investigation were found dead. The causes varied: car accidents, suicides, sudden illnesses, but the pattern was undeniable. Someone wanted the truth about Jonestown buried. And then one night, a journalist investigating the case received a chilling phone call. A distorted voice whispered over the line, "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop asking questions or you'll end up like the others." The journalist's hands trembled as they gripped the phone. The voice on the other end was distorted, inhuman, almost robotic. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop asking questions or you'll end up like the others." A click, then silence. The room suddenly felt suffocating. The journalist, a seasoned investigator who had covered political scandals and organized crime, had never encountered fear like this. Jonestown was supposed to be a closed case, mass suicide, a deranged cult leader, nothing more. But something didn't add up. The missing files, the disappearing witnesses, the pattern of sudden deaths among those who got too close to the truth. There was something far bigger at play. And someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. The next day, An email arrived from an anonymous source. The subject line was chillingly simple. I was there, and I know the truth. The email contained only a set of coordinates and a time. The journalist had two choices: ignore the lead and walk away, or chase the truth, even if it meant risking everything. They chose the latter. That night, in a dimly lit motel room far from the city, the journalist met the informant. The man, gaunt and nervous, wore a hood pulled low over his face. His hands twitched as he lit a cigarette. "You can call me Daniel," he said. "I was in Jonestown, and I saw what really happened." Daniel wasn't just a survivor. He had been part of Jim Jones' inner circle, one of the few trusted with the darkest secrets of the temple. But he had managed to escape before the massacre. He had been running ever since. Jones was crazy, yeah, but he wasn't working alone, Daniel whispered. His eyes darted to the window, scanning for threats. Jonestown wasn't just a commune, it was an experiment. The journalist's heart pounded. Experiment. Daniel took a deep breath, as if deciding how much to reveal. Jim was working with people, powerful people, government types. They gave him money, protection. They let him build Jonestown. And in return, he let them test their ideas on us. The journalist knew what Daniel was referring to: MKUltra, a decades-long CIA program designed to experiment with mind control techniques, using drugs, hypnosis, psychological torture. The government had claimed the program was shut down in the early 1970s. But what if it wasn't? Daniel leaned in closer. They were testing mass obedience, see? Could you make people give up everything? Make them believe anything? Even make them kill themselves on command? His voice dropped to a whisper. Jonestown wasn't a cult. It was a laboratory. The journalists felt the air leave their lungs. If this was true, it changed everything. But before they could ask more, Daniel froze. His face drained of color. Through the window, a black car sat idling across the street. "They found me," he choked out. Without another word, he bolted for the door. The journalist tried to stop him, but he was already gone. And by morning, Daniel was dead. The official report said it was an accident. Daniel's car had gone off the road at high speed, bursting into flames on impact. His body was unrecognizable. But the journalist knew better. This was no accident. Someone was tying up loose ends. Determined to uncover the truth, the journalist reached out to one last source, a former U.S. intelligence officer who had once investigated the People's Temple before suddenly retiring. The man was reluctant to talk, but left them with a single cryptic message: look beneath Jonestown. It wasn't until a team of private researchers returned to Guyana that the meaning became horrifyingly clear. Beneath the ruins of Jonestown, they found a hidden underground bunker. Inside were rows of empty cages, strange medical equipment, and files that suggested psychological conditioning experiments far beyond anything previously known. The final page of one report was stamped with 3 chilling letters: MKU, and scrawled in the margins, in Jim Jones' own handwriting, were 4 words that sent a chill down the journalist's spine. It worked. They obeyed. The journalist's hands trembled as they gripped the phone. The voice on the other end was distorted, inhuman, almost robotic. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop asking questions or you'll end up like the others." A click, then silence. The room suddenly felt suffocating. The journalist, a seasoned investigator who had covered political scandals and organized crime, had never encountered fear like this. Jonestown was supposed to be a closed case, mass suicide, a deranged cult leader, nothing more. But something didn't add up. The missing files, the disappearing witnesses, the pattern of sudden deaths among those who got too close to the truth. There was something far bigger at play, and someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. The next day, an email arrived from an anonymous source. The subject line was chillingly simple. I was there, and I know the truth. The email contained only a set of coordinates and a time. The journalist had two choices: ignore the lead and walk away, or chase the truth, even if it meant risking everything. They chose the latter. That night, in a dimly lit motel room far from the city, the journalist met the informant. The man, gaunt and nervous, wore a hood pulled low over his face. His hands twitched as he lit a cigarette. "You can call me Daniel," he said. "I was in Jonestown, and I saw what really happened." Daniel wasn't just a survivor. He had been part of Jim Jones' inner circle, one of the few trusted with the darkest secrets of the temple. But he had managed to escape before the massacre. He had been running ever since. Jones was crazy. Yeah, but he wasn't working alone, Daniel whispered. His eyes darted to the window, scanning for threats. Jonestown wasn't just a commune. It was an experiment. The journalist's heart pounded. Experiment. Daniel took a deep breath, as if deciding how much to reveal. Jim was working with people, powerful people, government types. They gave him money, protection. They let him build Jonestown. And in return, he let them test their ideas on us. The journalist knew what Daniel was referring to, MK-Ultra, a decades-long CIA program designed to experiment with mind control techniques, using drugs, hypnosis, psychological torture. The government had claimed the program was shut down in the early 1970s. But what if it wasn't? Daniel leaned in closer. They were testing mass obedience, see? Could you make people give up everything? Make them believe anything? Even make them kill themselves on command? His voice dropped to a whisper. Jonestown wasn't a cult. It was a laboratory. The journalists felt the air leave their lungs. If this was true, it changed everything. But before they could ask more, Daniel froze. His face drained of color. Through the window, a black car sat idling across the street. "They found me," he choked out. Without another word, he bolted for the door. The journalist tried to stop him, but he was already gone. And by morning, Daniel was dead. The official report said it was an accident. Daniel's car had gone off the road at high speed, bursting into flames on impact. His body was unrecognizable. But the journalist knew better. This was no accident. Someone was tying up loose ends. Determined to uncover the truth, the journalist reached out to one last source, a former U.S. intelligence officer who had once investigated the People's Temple before suddenly retiring. The man was reluctant to talk, but left them with a single cryptic message. Look beneath Jonestown. It wasn't until a team of private researchers returned to Guyana that the meaning became horrifyingly clear. Beneath the ruins of Jonestown, they found a hidden underground bunker. Inside were rows of empty cages, strange medical equipment, and files. Files that suggested psychological conditioning experiments far beyond anything previously known. The final page of one report was stamped with 3 chilling letters, MKU, and scrawled in the margins, in Jim Jones' own handwriting, were 4 words that sent a chill down the journalist's spine. It worked. They obeyed. The discovery of the underground bunker in Jonestown sent shockwaves through the world. The story exploded across international headlines. Jonestown was more than a cult. Secret experiments uncovered, and ignited a storm of controversy. Was Jim Jones truly just a delusional cult leader, or had he been a pawn in something far darker? The journalists who had uncovered the files barely had time to process the implications before everything started to spiral out of control. The morning after the revelation went public, their phone rang. The voice on the other end was the same distorted whisper from before. "You should have stayed quiet." Then the line went dead, and the journalists knew they were being hunted. The journalists packed a bag and left town immediately. The bunker discovery had rattled something or someone powerful, and they had no doubt that Daniel's fate was meant to be a warning. But they weren't the only ones on the move. Whistleblowers, former temple members, even a few retired government officials, people who had once stayed silent were now stepping forward, feeding the fire. Survivors spoke of strange psychological exercises in Jonestown, of outsiders visiting the compound who weren't part of the temple. Some even claimed to have seen experiments being conducted on those deemed unfaithful. The more the journalist uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Jonestown had never been about faith. It had been about control. As pressure mounted, the journalist received an anonymous tip, a name, Richard Halvorsen, a former intelligence officer. Halvorsen had disappeared from public records in the early 70s, around the same time that MKUltra supposedly shut down. But whispers in classified circles suggested he had continued working, off the books. and he had been seen in Guyana, near Jonestown, just months before the massacre. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. Tracking Halvorsen down was nearly impossible. He had no official residence, no known associates, nothing but a few scattered rumors. But the journalist wasn't working alone anymore. One of their news sources, a former Temple member named Lisa Harrington, claimed to have seen him inside Jonestown the night before the mass suicide. He was with Jones, Lisa said, her voice trembling. They were arguing. Jones was scared. Scared? The idea that Jim Jones, a man who had controlled and terrorized thousands, had been afraid of Halvorsen was unsettling. With Lisa's help, the journalist followed the trail to an abandoned military facility in rural Virginia, a relic of the Cold War. And there, in the decaying ruins of an old intelligence post, they found him. Halvorsen was an old man now, but his eyes were sharp, his movements quick. He didn't seem surprised to see them. "I knew someone would come eventually," he said, lighting a cigarette. "I just didn't expect it to take this long." The journalist wasted no time. "Jonestown, the experiments. You were there." Halvorsen exhaled smoke, watching them carefully. "I was." He didn't deny it. He didn't even hesitate. "What was it?" the journalist pressed. "Mind control? Mass psychological conditioning." Halvorsen let out a dry chuckle. "You think this was just some government test?" He shook his head. "You're not thinking big enough." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Jonestown was a success. The journalist's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Halvorsen took another drag of his cigarette before answering. "The real question," he said, "is why Jim Jones lost control." The journalist froze. "What do you mean lost control?" Halvorsen looked him dead in the eye. "Because Jim wasn't the one running the experiment anymore." The words hung in the air, suffocating. Lisa spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying someone else took over?" Halvorsen nodded. "We created Jonestown to study obedience. How far people would go if you stripped away their reality and rebuilt it with something new. Jones was perfect for the job. He had a natural charisma, an ability to make people believe. But something changed. His voice dropped. It was like something else got inside. The journalist's pulse pounded in their ears. Something else. Halvorsen hesitated. Then he leaned in close. "You ever heard Jones' final recording?" They had. The infamous death tape, recorded during the last moments of Jonestown. But before they could speak, Halvorsen whispered something that sent a shiver down their spine. "Listen again. But this time, listen to the background." The journalists wasted no time. They found a quiet motel room, locked the door, and played the recording. Jones' voice crackled through the speakers, urging his followers to die for the cause. The sound of crying children, wailing mothers, the sloshing of liquid as the poison was distributed. But then, beneath it all, something else, something inhuman. It wasn't just Jones speaking. There was another voice, a whisper layered beneath his words, so faint it was almost imperceptible, a voice coaching him, repeating his words, guiding him. And then, in the final second of the tape, as the last screams faded into silence, the whisper spoke alone. They were only the beginning. The journalist recoiled, heart hammering. The voice hadn't belonged to Jones. It had belonged to something else. They sat in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. Was it another person? An unknown figure manipulating Jones from the shadows? Or was it something far worse? Something that had never been human? The truth was still out there, and the journalist wasn't going to stop until they found it. But as they stepped outside, they froze. A black car was parked across the street, waiting, watching, and they knew the real nightmare had only just begun. The world watched as the truth unraveled. The journalist's expose had shaken the highest levels of power. The files from the Jonestown bunker, the whispers of mind control, the haunting voice on the death tape. Everything pointed to a sinister force operating behind Jim Jones. But the public needed a villain, and they found one in Richard Halvorsen. The FBI moved quickly. Halvorsen was taken into custody in a dramatic midnight raid, dragged from his hidden compound as cameras flashed. The headline screamed, Ex-CIA officer arrested for role in Jonestown Massacre. His trial was a media circus. Survivors of the People's Temple testified, recounting horrific tales of control, torture, and manipulation. Declassified documents linked him to psychological warfare programs. Whispers of MKUltra resurfaced, forcing the government to deny its involvement once again. Halvorsen never denied his role in Jonestown, but he insisted that he wasn't the one in charge. "You think you found the villain," he sneered in court, "but you don't even know what you're fighting." It didn't matter. The public wanted justice, and Halvorsen became the scapegoat. Sentenced to life in prison, he was locked away in a high-security facility, a relic of the darkest parts of America's past. The case, it seemed, was finally closed. Jonestown secrets had been dragged into the light, and the consequences were immediate. New laws were passed restricting government experiments on civilians. Survivors formed advocacy groups, demanding full transparency on past human experiments. Urban legends exploded. Whispers of mind control experiments that never ended, of secret communes still operating in the shadows. Jonestown was no longer just a cult tragedy. It had become something far more terrifying, a cautionary tale of what happens when the wrong people play God. For a while, the world moved on. The journalists who had uncovered it all tried to put the case behind them. The nightmares never stopped, but they told themselves it was over until the letter arrived. A single envelope slipped under their door. No return address. No postage. Inside was a sheet of paper and 4 chilling words written in Jim Jones' handwriting. It worked. They obeyed. The journalist's hands shook as they reread the words. The same phrase Jones had scrawled in the bunker. But Jim Jones had been dead for years. Hadn't he? Determined to find the source, the journalist had the handwriting analyzed. The expert confirmed the impossible. The ink was fresh. The signature was a perfect match. And the paper itself contained something even more disturbing. Microscopic traces of cyanide, just like the poison used in Jonestown. Someone, somewhere, wanted them to know. Jonestown wasn't over. It had only just begun. The journalist stared at the letter, their pulse hammering. Jim Jones had been dead for decades. And yet, here was his handwriting, fresh ink on fresh paper, laced with traces of cyanide. The weight of the discovery pressed down on them. Who had sent this? Why now? Before they could process it, their phone rang. A deep, trembling voice rasped through the speaker. "They're waking up." Then the line went dead. The journalists barely had time to breathe before their inbox pinged. Breaking news. Jonestown survivor found dead. Cover suspected? They clicked the link and felt their stomach drop. Lisa Harrington. The same Lisa who had helped them track down Halvorsen. She had been found in her apartment, dead from cyanide poisoning. Just like Jonestown. On her nightstand, investigators found a single sheet of paper. 4 words. It worked. They obeyed. Before the journalist could react, another shockwave hit. The news was everywhere. Richard Halvorsen was recanting his confession. In an emergency statement from prison, the former intelligence officer denied everything. "I was framed," he declared. "Jonestown wasn't my experiment. I was trying to stop it." The media erupted. Had the government locked up the wrong man? Had they buried the truth? Or, more terrifyingly, had Halvorsen been telling the truth all along? Desperate for answers, the journalists returned to the Jonestown death tape. They had listened before, but this time they played it differently, slowing it down, isolating frequencies. The results were horrifying. There was something beneath Jim Jones' voice. Not just a whispering presence they had noticed before. Something more. A pattern. A hidden voice, buried in the static, speaking commands. It was directing him. And the commands weren't just for Jones. They were for everyone. The journalist contacted an audio forensics expert, sending them the slowed-down version of the tape. Hours later, they received a call. The expert's voice shook. "This isn't background noise," they said. "This is programming." The journalist's breath caught. "What do you mean?" A pause. This tape wasn't just a recording of mass suicide. It was a trigger. The revelation sent shockwaves through the world. Jonestown survivors, scattered across the globe, began experiencing terrifying blackouts, waking up with no memory of where they had been. Some were found muttering Jones' sermons in their sleep. Others went missing altogether. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories. Was someone activating them? Had Jonestown's followers been programmed not to die but to wait? And if so, for what? As panic spread, the journalists received one final message, a video file. They opened it and froze. It was surveillance footage. Inside a subway station, a man in a tattered suit stood in the center of the platform, swaying slightly. His face was hidden beneath the hood of a ragged coat. The footage zoomed in. The journalist's stomach twisted into a knot. The man was Jim Jones, or someone who looked exactly like him. Then the hooded figure lifted his head and smiled. The screen went black. Then one final message appeared, typed across the screen. It worked. They obeyed. The world was unraveling. Authorities scrambled to contain the rising panic as the footage of Jim Jones, or whatever had worn his face, spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with terrified theories. He never died. Jonestown was a test run. The sleepers are waking up. Law enforcement dismissed the video as an elaborate hoax, but behind closed doors, they were anything but confident. The journalists had already received confirmation. The footage had been authenticated. No digital manipulation. No deepfake. The man in that subway station was real. And worse, he wasn't alone. Across the country, Jonestown survivors were vanishing. Some left behind cryptic messages scrawled in their own blood. Others were found staring at walls for hours, whispering sermons from decades ago. A retired police chief in California, a man who had investigated Jonestown in 1978, shot himself in his backyard, leaving behind a single note. I hear him in my head. He's calling us home. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something had been left behind in Jonestown, and it was waking up. The journalists dug deeper, following every lead. They cross-referenced survivor records, missing persons cases, and classified files leaked in the wake of Halvorson's trial. That's when they found it. A pattern. The disappearances weren't random. They were following a route, a direct path leading back to Guyana, back to Jonestown. But who was leading them? As the journalists prepared to leave, they received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You're looking in the wrong place." Attached was a single image, a scanned government document, so heavily redacted it was nearly unreadable. But the sender had highlighted two words in blood-red ink, Dr. Malcolm Rhodes. The name meant nothing to them, but a quick search changed everything. Dr. Malcolm Rhodes had been a government scientist specializing in psychological warfare in the 1970s. He had worked with the CIA, conducted experiments on behavioral conditioning, and, most disturbingly, had been directly tied to the MKUltra program. Then, in 1978, he had vanished, the same year as Jonestown. Rhodes was supposed to be dead, but if there was anything the journalists had learned, it was that death wasn't always the end. Tracking him down became an obsession. They followed a paper trail of shell companies, black market medical facilities, and whispers of human experimentation. Finally, they found him. A private compound in the deep Amazon rainforest, not far from the ruins of Jonestown. The journalist's heart pounded. Rhodes hadn't just been involved in Jonestown. He had never left. Armed with this revelation, the journalist tried to warn the authorities. But every call ended the same way. Disconnection, silence, or a voice whispering. It worked. They obeyed. They were being watched. They were being hunted. And they were running out of time. Because Jonestown survivors weren't the only ones disappearing. Their own sources were vanishing too. And Lisa Harrington, the one person who had helped expose the truth, was already dead. The journalists had only one option left. They had to go to Jonestown before it was too late. The jungle was alive with sound, hissing insects, distant cries of unseen creatures, and the rhythmic pounding of the journalist's heart. They weren't supposed to be here. No one was. But Jonestown was calling, and they had no choice but to answer. armed with a camera, a notebook, and a pistol they barely knew how to use. The journalists pressed deeper into the rainforest. They weren't alone. A former FBI agent, Tom Carter, had agreed to come. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in government cover-ups. And everything about Jonestown reeked of one. The third member of their party was David Grayson, a surviving ex-member of the People's Temple. He had been just a teenager when the massacre happened, but he remembered things that didn't make sense, memories that had haunted him for decades. Now he had returned, because like the journalist, he knew something was waiting for them, something that had never left. Hours into their trek, they found it, a bunker, not the crumbling ruins of Jonestown's main buildings, but something else, something that hadn't been there before, made of concrete, reinforced with steel doors and partially swallowed by jungle growth. The structure looked newer than the rest of Jonestown. Carter swept the area, his gun drawn. This isn't 1978. Someone's been here. Grayson swallowed hard, staring at the heavy door. I think they never left. With a deep breath, the journalist pushed the door open. Inside, they found hell. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, rusted floor stands, blood-stained chairs, and broken restraint belts. Faded photographs of Jim Jones and Dr. Malcolm Rhodes hung side by side on a bulletin board. But the real horror was further inside. A long, sterile hallway, a series of locked rooms. Carter forced one open. Inside, they found bodies, rows of them, strapped to gurneys, wearing hospital gowns. Some had tubes still stuck in their arms, as if they had been pumped with something before death. Others weren't dead at all. One man's eyes fluttered open as they stepped forward. His mouth trembled, lips forming silent words. The journalist leaned closer. His breath smelled like rotting fruit and chemicals. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. It worked. They obeyed. His body seized violently. Then he stopped breathing. Footsteps. Somewhere deeper in the bunker. They weren't alone. Carter grabbed the journalist's arm. We need to go. Now. But Grayson wasn't moving. He was staring at a nearby door, one labeled in red ink. Archive room. We have to see what's inside, he insisted. This is what we came for. The journalist hesitated. Footsteps were getting closer. Then Carter made the choice for them. He kicked the door open. Inside were file cabinets, old tapes, and documents stacked to the ceiling. Grayson rushed to a cabinet and yanked it open, scanning the files. Then he stopped. His face turned white. Oh my God! He handed the journalist a single yellow document. They read it, and the truth hit them like a freight train. Jonestown wasn't just a cult. It was a project, a human experiment in obedience and control. And it hadn't ended in 1978, because the real test had never been mass suicide. The real test was survival. Scrawled across the bottom of the document was a final note, written in Jim Jones' unmistakable handwriting. Only the worthy would wake up. The journalist felt sick. Jonestown hadn't been a failure. It had been a harvest. And the survivors, they hadn't survived at all. A loud bang echoed down the hallway. Carter spun, gun raised. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. Dr. Malcolm Rhodes. He was old now, his face gaunt, his hair wispy and white. But his eyes were still sharp, still hungry. You were never supposed to find this, Rhodes murmured. Then he smiled. But it's too late now. The bunker exploded into motion. Figures emerged from the darkness. Jonestown survivors, vacant-eyed, twitching, whispering sermons under their breath. They weren't here to talk. They were here to finish the experiment. Carter fired a warning shot. No one flinched. The journalist turned to run and came face to face with Jim Jones. He smiled and whispered, "Welcome home." The bunker was burning. The jungle glowed orange with fire as smoke curled into the night sky. Gunshots rang out, followed by panic screams. The journalist ran, lungs burning, feet pounding against the dirt. They didn't know where Carter was, only that he had screamed for them to get out. Grayson had fallen behind, and Jim Jones, or whatever he had become, was still in there, watching, smiling. And then, the explosion. A shockwave tore through the jungle, sending the journalists crashing into the dirt. Flames erupted behind them, swallowing the bunker whole. The cult, the experiments, the secrets, all of it consumed by fire. And just like that, Jonestown was gone. Carter was dead. His body was found near the tree line, gun in hand. Spent shells around him. He had fought to the last second. Grayson was never found. No body, no trace. The official report would claim he was killed in the explosion. But the journalist wasn't so sure. And as for Jim Jones, the bunker had collapsed on itself, burning down to ash and rubble. There was no sign of him in the wreckage. No body, no bones, nothing. The journalist returned home, but the world was different now. They couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every night, they dreamed of Jonestown, of Jim Jones whispering in their ear, of Grayson standing in the flames, smiling as if he had finally found peace. Or worse, as if he had finally understood. The authorities covered up the truth. The bunker was officially labeled an abandoned drug lab. Carter's death? Unfortunate but unrelated. The journalists tried to fight it, but every source they had vanished. The survivors? Gone. The records? Sealed. The truth? Buried. Just like before. Then, one evening, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, a single cassette tape. The journalist's hands shook as they placed it into an old recorder. A familiar voice crackled through the speakers. Jim Jones. My dear, dear children. The journalist's breath caught. You thought you could stop me. But Jonestown was never a place. It was a message, and the message is still spreading. The tape ended with 4 final words. 4 words that had haunted them since the beginning. It worked. They obeyed. The journalist yanked the tape from the player, threw it in the fire, watched as the plastic melted. And yet, as the flames consumed it, they swore they could still hear his voice. Laughing, whispering, waiting. The official story of Jonestown never changed. It remained what history books had always claimed. A tragic mass suicide, a cautionary tale of blind faith, and a madman who led his people to their deaths. But those who knew the truth, the journalists, a handful of investigators, and those who had stumbled too close to the darkness, knew that Jonestown's story didn't end in 1978. It never ended at all. Decades passed, and the legend of Jim Jones and the People's Temple only grew. Documentaries were made, each one dissecting the madness and manipulation behind the infamous massacre. Conspiracy theorists latched onto government involvement. The eerie parallels to MKUltra and the vanishing survivors who had reappeared decades later, only to vanish again. Podcasts whispered of a secret cult that still existed in the shadows, carrying out Jones' unfinished work. Some claimed to have seen him, alive, watching, waiting. Theories spread like wildfire. Jonestown wasn't suicide, it was an experiment. Survivors were activated years later, conditioned to obey. Dr. Malcolm Rhodes had never died. Jim Jones had never died. No one could prove anything, but no one could disprove it either. The bunker fire had destroyed nearly all evidence, but some things refused to burn. In 2028, a classified document was leaked online. It contained one disturbing revelation. Among the bodies recovered in Jonestown in 1978, one was never identified. A man who looked like Jim Jones, but whose dental records didn't match. Theories erupted. If the body in Jonestown wasn't Jim Jones, then where was he? In 2032, a tourist in Guyana took a photo near the ruins of Jonestown. In the background, a man in sunglasses and a preacher's suit stood in the shadows. The tourist swore he hadn't been there when the photo was taken. The photo went viral. Comparisons were made. It looked like Jim Jones. But that was impossible, wasn't it? One night, the journalist received an email. No subject line. No sender. Just a single attachment. They hesitated, hands shaking as they clicked it open. It was an audio file. Static crackled. Then, "My dear, dear children." The journalist's blood ran cold. It was the same voice. The same message from the tape they had burned years ago. Only this time, there were new words at the end. Jonestown was never a place. It was a beginning, and beginnings never truly end. The journalist slammed the laptop shut, but they could still hear it. Somewhere in the night, a voice whispering in the darkness, laughing, waiting, because Jonestown had never died, and it never would.